welcome, and it's great to see so many people here in this tiny little room. But as Bethan explained, we've had our meeting cancelled by the university, and I'm not going to go into why, but you know, it's unfortunate these things happen. It's not the first time it's happening. We're not the only organisation this has happened to. But however, it's good that, you know, they haven't been able to scrap the meeting in itself. We've been able to go ahead and do this. So just to give people a bit of background of who Stop the War are and what we stand for, basically. So we, as an organisation, came together with lots of people over 10 years ago. So basically when we saw the attacks on the Twin Towers, it was very obvious that the American government and the British government were going to use that as a drive to war. And very quickly, a national meeting was held in London where groups of people came together, organisations predominantly Stop the War, CND, and the Muslim Association of Britain, who came together and said, we're not going to stand for this. You know, we recognise that they want to go to war, but we want to make it very clear that what they do is not in our name. And it has been over 10 years, and the basis of that organisation was no to war, no to Islamophobia, and a recognition that actually we're not going to have peace in the Middle East until we have justice for the Palestinian people. Those are the three basic claims that we stood up for, and we still stand by those claims, and it was what we've campaigned on over a number of years. And our position was that, you know, what happened at the Twin Towers was devastating, but actually the people of Afghanistan were not responsible. You know, there was a small group of terrorists funded by all sorts of people that did what they did, and actually the people in Afghanistan themselves should not be held responsible. And if you actually look at history and look at the people that were responsible for those actions, they weren't even from Afghanistan. So the idea that we should go and bomb Afghanistan and then Iraq as a way of stopping a terrorist organisation called Al Qaeda at the time, it was absolutely crazy. But at the time, Tony Blair made this amazing speech in Parliament where he talked about this dossier, and in that dossier they talked about how Saddam Hussein could launch an attack on British people, on British soldiers in Cyprus and places like that, in a matter of minutes. So I think his was 20 or 40 minutes. This was what his claim was. He also claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Now, history has told us that's not true. They also told us actually that they were going to bomb Afghanistan because the women in Afghanistan were oppressed by the Taliban. Now, I don't really know how that works, but I'm pretty sure bombing women is not in any way liberating them. But that was a line they used. And I even remember they pulled out people, you know, the wife of Tony Blair at the time and George Bush, to come out and make this big thing about sisters in Afghanistan, and this is what we're doing it for. And most of us just looked at it and were horrified that they could even talk about rescuing Afghan women by bombing that country. But that's what they did. And what's really interesting is that everything we argued at the time has been proved right over time. We've always been right about the dossier, how it was dodgy. It was, you know, by some PhD students that was found online, and they used it as intelligence. You know, the American government did this huge presentation in front of the UN to argue for war. None of those facts turned out to be true. It didn't make the Middle East a safer place. We can see that now. And what we're seeing now is actually a consequence of those actions. And we have continued to campaign against those wars. As an organisation, we were responsible for getting 2 million on the streets of London on February the 15th, and it was part of a global day of action around the world. There were demonstrations, and people, you know, really saw what it meant to come together and argue against what our government was doing. And I think the reason a lot of people did that was because they were very angry with what was happening in Parliament. Because at the time, for people that don't know, it was actually the Labour government that were driving this war machine. And it was quite shocking for those of us that weren't active, hadn't done anything political, to sit at home and watch this kind of rush to war and feel that nobody was speaking for us. And I think that's why people took the streets. We had massive walkouts at university campuses, we had occupations. It was a time when, you know, people felt we could change the world, and in some ways we did, because everything we argued became true. People began to understand that politicians lie. Even when they take us to war, they lie. Unfortunately, they're willing to do that. The other thing that they wanted to do, there was a number of countries they wanted to attack, and actually by demonstrating we held them back, because they argue that we're going to go to war in Iraq, we're going to go to war in Afghanistan, we're going to be welcomed by open arms, and people are going to welcome our soldiers by flowers, basically, and it never happened. Actually, what happened is we occupied these countries, we caused a massive amount of bloodshed, which in most cases didn't even count how many people we killed, and what's that done is create more anger towards the British government, the Western governments across the world. And indeed what we did, we also propped up, and are still propping up, a number of dictators across the Middle East. And this is really why we're seeing the growth of organisations such as ISIS. You know, the organiser before them was, well, Al-Qaeda, you know, and now they're called ISIS, and I think if we think we're going to bomb ISIS into oblivion, there'll be another organisation, because what we know is killing and bombing people in the Middle East does not create a safer world. Now, they have argued in this case that, you know, there were those terrible terrorist attacks in Paris, and it was devastating. We all watched it on the news, and it was really upsetting. And their argument, yet again, is we need to go and attack ISIS in Syria, because they're responsible for what happened in Paris. Actually, what happened in Paris was that a number of individuals that used what was happening in the Middle East and the ideology of revenge and hatred to actually bomb people in Paris. Actually, and I'm not sure how bombing a small region in Syria is actually going to solve that issue. It isn't. We have to have a democratic solution, a political solution for the Middle East. But one of the key things I think we need to do from our government is A, stop bombing Syrians. For people that don't know, there are presently 13 countries involved in bombing Syria. 13 countries over a number of years have been involved in bombing Syria. It hasn't stopped the attacks in Paris. It didn't stop the attacks in Beirut the night before the attacks in Paris, which people don't really talk about. It hasn't made British people feel any safer. If anything, we kind of feel like now we're a target because our government is yet again bombing a country in the Middle East. This is not the solution. So, you know, it was unfortunate we had that vote in Parliament, and Parliament decided yes to go ahead and to bomb. But what was really important running up to that vote is that so many British people got out on the streets, demonstrated, had their voices heard, and actually lobbied the Labour MPs. And that's really interesting, because we're being told constantly that actually these politicians, they feel bullied. They feel like their constituents are threatening them in somehow. I don't think writing to your Labour MP is in any way threatening. Writing to your Labour MP and saying this is what's going to happen in Syria, here's pictures of people in the Middle East suffering, I don't think that's threatening. I don't think it's threatening to hold your politician to account and say, well, you know, we're going to deselect you. I think Stop the War stands by the idea that our representatives are meant to represent us. When they voted in Parliament, they should have been voting for their constituents and what their constituents stand for. Let's be quite clear. All the polls show that over 70% of British people don't want us bombing in Syria. Over 70%. That's a huge number of people. So I'm not sure who these Labour politicians are that said, you know, well, you know, it's a moral decision. I've thought about it, and it is not a moral decision. You represent the people that elected you, and therefore you vote the way we want you to vote. And I want to say, well done to everybody, and I know there's a number of people in this room that did lobby their MPs, and well done, because we stand by this. But I want to also say that although we've gone to war, and Britain is now involved in bombing one of the poorest and most devastated countries in the Middle East, because they've already been bombed for a number of years, we will continue to fight. We're not going to give up. We want our government to stop bombing the Middle East. We want them to stop propping up dictators. We want them to stop funding all sides of conflict in the Middle East. We want them to stop selling arms to the Middle East. Because let's be honest, when they're going about how terrible ISIS is, and this is why we're doing it, let's not forget Saudi Arabia. If you put their human rights record against each other, they're very similar. But we're happy to sell, and I do need to wrap up, but I do want to say one thing. We are going to continue to fight. We are going to continue to campaign against this government. And one of the key things as part of that struggle is to make sure that we take as many people down to London on Saturday for the national demonstration. It's very important that we don't just give up. You know, we have got everything to fight for. We have won in the past, we can win this. So please, if you are around and you do want to get involved, give us your details. There's a table at the back with everyone's contact sheets. Book yourself onto a coach to London on Saturday. If you can't come to London, please do volunteer to give us some money, because actually, unlike the world leaders who have a load of money to buy, you know, on weapons and all the rest of it, we are an organisation, and the strength of our organisation are the people in this room. So if you can't go, help us fund for someone else to go. Thank you.